She first saw him where the grass forgot how to stand. By late afternoon the prairie had gone still in that strange, held-breath way it did after gunfire. Smoke thinned on the horizon like a torn curtain. The flies had already found the fallen. Overhead the sky was a clean, impossible blue, the same sky that watched over marble columns in Rome and narrow London streets, now watching only dust, blood, and one rancher's daughter riding where her father would have forbidden her to go. Clara Weston kept her mare to a careful walk, eyes moving the way her father had taught her. Slow enough to see, quick enough to survive. She hadn't come with the soldiers. She had waited until the shouting stopped, until the thunder of hoofs faded, and then she had followed the ache in her chest to see what remained. The Good Samaritan walked beside her in memory, asking his quiet, persistent question, "And who is my neighbor?" Her mare's ears flicked toward a dip in the land. There, half hidden by a fallen cottonwood whose roots clawed the air like a dead giant's hand, she saw a shape that was not quite still enough to be dead. At first he looked like the others, another dark form abandoned to the mercy of sun and flies. But even at a distance she felt something in him holding on, a tension that did not belong to corpses. She slid from the saddle, boots whispering through the grass, her braids swinging against her back like a pendulum counting out her courage. He was Apache. She had seen men like him from far-off ridges, riding like storm clouds, or watching the town with eyes like polished obsidian. Up close he was all clean, severe lines, high cheekbones, straight nose, dark hair tied back, skin browned by sun and war. Blood had soaked his left shoulder, staining the doeskin of his shirt in a black-red bloom. His eyes were open. They fixed on her with the still, measuring intensity of a hawk's gaze, taking in her braid, her worn skirt, her empty hands. "Sir," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended, the way Juliet's might have sounded the first time she saw the stranger in her father's garden. "Can you hear me?" For a long heartbeat he did not answer. Wind brushed the grass around them, carrying the fading reek of powder and the clean, bruised scent of crushed sage. At last he spoke, his voice low, roughened at the edges. "If you came to finish what they started," he murmured, "you should have brought a gun." Her breath shook, but she made herself meet his gaze. "If I meant to kill you," she replied, "I wouldn't be calling you sir." Something ghosted across his face, not quite a smile, not quite scorn. His eyes flicked to the mare, to the open sky, back to her. "Why are you here, rancher's girl?" he asked. A dozen book spines flashed in her mind. Homer's warriors laid out and tended by patient hands, knights in Mallory's tales brought half-dead from battle to quiet rooms, Ruth gleaning for a widowed mother-in-law. The stories had braided themselves into her like another strand of hair. "Because you're bleeding," she said simply. "And because leaving you like this would sit wrong in my soul." He studied her a moment longer, as if testing the strength of her words the way one tests a horse's legs. Then, with deliberate care, he shifted his shoulder away from the tree. Pain carved a deeper line beside his mouth. "If you mean to help me," he said, "come closer." The harshness in his face did not soften. His jaw stayed set, his shoulders tight, every line of him a warning. Yet beneath it she sensed something else, weariness perhaps, or the faintest thread of trust. It reminded her of a gate on a rusted hinge, still heavy, still stubborn, but not entirely unwilling to move. She knelt in the grass, the hem of her skirt drinking in dust and blood. Up close, the wound was ugly, a bullet crease rather than a hole, tearing flesh instead of passing through. The bleeding had slowed to a thick, sluggish ooze, but the skin around it was hot and angry. "This is going to hurt," she said. He snorted softly. "You are not the first to tell me that." She tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat. Her mother would faint, she thought distantly, and dampened it from her canteen. When she pressed the wet cloth to his shoulder, he didn't flinch. His hand did, though, fingers digging into the dirt as his breath hissed between his teeth. "I've seen men scream for less," Clara murmured. "They were not Apache," he said. The word sat between them like a drawn knife, both shield and challenge. Clara might have backed away on another day. Instead she looked at his white-knuckled fist, then at his face. "I'm not made of glass either," she said quietly. "If you need to grip something, you can take my hand instead of the ground." That surprised him. It showed in the smallest ways. A blink, a tiny easing of his brow, the way his gaze sharpened as if focusing on a new kind of danger. "Do you offer your hand to every wounded man you find in the grass, little rancher?" he asked. Only the ones who look at me like I'm a threat instead of help, she said. It reminds them I'm human. It reminds me they are too. For a moment the only sound was the wind and the persistent buzz of flies. Then very slowly he uncurled his fingers from the dirt. He hesitated, one breath, two, and set his hand in hers. His palm was calloused, hard from rains and rifles, but warm. Hers was smaller, work-roughened in its own way, smelling faintly of horses and lye soap. They did not fit perfectly, but they fit enough. "My name is Clara," she said, because there was something indecent about holding a man's hand and not offering a name. He watched her, eyes dark as river stones. "Dason," he said at last. "My name is Dason." She repeated it under her breath, Dason, like something from an old, untranslated poem. Then she bent again to her work, his hand anchoring hers as she cleaned the wound. Time thinned. The sun slid west, shadows stretched long. The cottonwood leaves whispered overhead like pages turning. Dason's grip tightened when she found the worst of the torn flesh, then loosened as her touch turned gentler. He did not curse or complain. The hard planes of his face stayed composed, but his fingers trembled almost imperceptibly in her grasp. To fill the silence she spoke, not the nervous chatter she used with town boys, but true small things. "My father says the land remembers every hoof print," she murmured. "I think it remembers wounds too. It seems right to try and mend what we can." "You talk like a book," Dason said, a ghost of wryness in his voice. "I read like one," she answered. "A traveling teacher left a box of them in town. I think I've read every soul in it twice. The Iliad with its proud, foolish men. A bit of Shakespeare with his storms and kings and lovers who should have known better." "Stories will not stop bullets," he said. "No," she agreed. "But they might stop us from becoming the kind of people who fire without thinking." He said nothing, but something in the harsh set of his jaw eased by a hair's breadth. When she had bound the wound as best she could, Clara sat back on her heels, brushing dust from her hands. The prairie stretched around them, wide and watchful. In that great emptiness, the two of them felt like a single line scribbled on a blank page. "How far is your camp?" she asked. "Farther than I can walk with one bad shoulder and your small patience," he said. "Then you'll ride," she replied. "My father's cabin is closer. There's shade and coffee and a bed that creaks but holds. You can heal there. When you're strong enough, you can decide where to go." He stared at her. "You would bring an Apache warrior into your father's house?" he asked. "Your people shoot at mine from behind fences." "Sometimes," she said. "And sometimes they carry wounded colts into the barn and sit up all night so the little fool doesn't die. My father has more kindness than his temper admits. He may shout when he sees you. He may send us both to church. But he won't throw a man back into the dirt if I'm standing there saying, 'He's under my care.'" "You're small," Dason said slowly. "But you stand like a tree that has decided which way to grow." She felt herself flush. "That may be the best thing anyone has ever said about my stubbornness." A shadow of a laugh moved through him, surprising them both. With effort and with her shoulder under his good arm, she helped him to his feet. When he swayed, she steadied him, the weight of him heavy and real against her. At the mare he paused, hand pressed to the horse's warm neck. "If I faint," he said, eyes flicking down to her, "you'll be crushed." "Then don't faint," she said briskly. "I have no desire to be a tragic footnote in someone else's epic." That earned a full if brief smile. It changed his face not by softening its angles, but by lighting something behind them. For a moment he looked less like a carved idol of war and more like a man who had once laughed often. He mounted with a grimace and a bitten-off breath. Clara took the reins and walked beside the mare, one hand near his knee in case he slipped. The sun dipped lower, the prairie turned gold, then copper. Grass brushed her skirts, crickets tuned their evening choir. "You should fear me more than you do," Dason said at one point, his gaze on the far hills. "And you should fear me more than you do," she replied. "I know how to make coffee strong enough to kill." "That is not the same as carrying a rifle," he said. "Sometimes," she said, "a bad cup of coffee is worse." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a cough. Either way it warmed the space between them. The cabin rose out of the land at last. A small, weather-gray box with a stovepipe like an exclamation mark puncturing the sky. Familiar as a well-thumbed page. Smoke curled from the chimney. Cows lowed in the distance. The world narrowed to things she knew how to hold. Inside, she eased him onto the narrow bed, then stoked the stove and set water to boil. When she came back with fresh cloths and a tin of salve, he tensed again as if remembering to be stone. "You've done enough," he said. "I can bind it myself." "I don't doubt that," Clara said. "I also don't doubt you'll do it badly. Brave men are often cowards around soap. Hold still." He did, though his jaw flexed when she untied the makeshift bandage and cleaned the wound again. Each time he flinched, she slowed her hands and reached for words. "In the Iliad," she said, "even Achilles had his wounds washed by friends. There's no shame in needing care. Great warriors don't lose honor by letting someone keep them alive." "You compare me to your heroes," he said, voice tight. "You don't know what I've done." "I know enough," she answered. "I know you could have knocked me aside back there. You didn't. I know you gave me your name. I know you have not once complained when I tug at your skin." Her fingers brushed the edge of the bandage. His breathing hitched. "There are men in town who have never bled for anything but their own pride and yet speak as if God himself consults them personally. I would rather tend you than them." He turned his head sharply to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something that had nothing to do with pain. "You are not what I expected of a rancher's daughter," he said. "You are not what I expected of an Apache warrior," she replied. "What did you expect?" he asked. "More stone," she said. "Less listening." Silence held for a long moment. The stove ticked softly. The wind rubbed its fingers along the walls. At last he let out a slow breath. "I listen," Dason said quietly, "so I know where danger comes from." "And do you hear it now?" she asked, tying off the bandage. He watched her, really watched her, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the loose tendril of hair stuck to her damp neck, the steady concentration in her eyes. "No," he said. "Not here." That confession settled between them like a third presence, unseen but undeniable. Days passed. The wound knit itself together under her hands. Each morning she checked the bandage, brewed coffee so bitter it might have woken the dead, and made him sit in the doorway to let the light find his face. At first he bore her, fussing like a man endures bad weather, grim, silent, sure it would pass. But gradually his edges changed. He insisted on chopping wood with his good arm, creating an absurdly neat stack. When she burned her fingers on the kettle, he caught her hand gently, wrapping the reddened skin in a cool cloth with a touch careful enough to shame a nurse. When she came in from mending a fence, shoulders slumped and braid half undone, he wordlessly took the quilt from the bed and draped it over her, the gesture precise and strangely formal, as if he were placing a cloak on a queen. Care moved both ways now, like water in a shared cup. One night a storm rolled in, a roaring Shakespearean thing that rattled the shutters and turned the sky into a battlefield of its own. Lightning clawed the clouds. Thunder shook the boards under Clara's feet. She tried to read, but her hands shook. The cabin had never felt so small. Dason watched from his chair by the hearth, then rose, more steadily now, and sat down beside her on the floor, their shoulders almost touching. "In my grandmother's stories," he said above the thunder, "storms are just the sky remembering it is alive. It shouts so it does not forget. We listen so we remember we are smaller than we think." She let out a shaky breath that turned a little into a laugh. "You talk like a book too," she said. "I listened well," he answered. In the flickering light his face looked different. Not magically softened, not turned handsome by some foolish illusion, but human in a way that made her chest ache. The harsh plains were still there, carved by sun and hard choices, but now she could see the weariness in them, the long, quiet endurance. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For sitting here," she said. "For not letting me pretend I am brave when I am not. Samwise did the same for Frodo in a tale a preacher gave me, a small friend carrying the bigger burden when it mattered. The world may be large, but sometimes courage is just staying." He considered that, eyes on the fire. "Staying is not a small thing," he said at last. Neither of them moved away. Another evening, when the light outside went honey-soft and the grass burned gold at the tips, Clara read aloud from a battered book of Shakespeare. Not the whole play, just snatches, Lear raging against his storm, a sonnet or two about love that refused to die politely. When she closed the cover, Dason was looking at her with that hawk gaze again. "Your voice changes when you speak their words," he said. "As if you were taller." Stories stretch us, she said, a little embarrassed. They make room for things we haven't lived yet. And what is there room for now? He asked quietly. She thought of his weight against her in the grass, of his hand wrapping her burned fingers, of his shoulder brushing hers while the sky raged. For the idea, she said slowly, that love is less about grand speeches and more about care. About binding wounds you didn't cause. About seeing the person under the armor and choosing them anyway. The word love hung in the air, fragile and bright, like the flame of a lamp carried across a dark room. You speak of love as if you have seen it, Dason said. I have seen hints, she replied. In my parents. In the way you would not let me carry the water pail yesterday when your shoulder still ached. She smiled a little. In the way you complain about my coffee but always finish the cup. That is survival, he said. Sometimes, she answered, survival is just what love looks like with its sleeves rolled up. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the first stars pricked the dark. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its roughness. In my people's stories, he said, love is not softness. It is fire that keeps the old from freezing. It is carrying the sick when the village must move. It is staying awake on the ridge all night so children can sleep. It is bleeding so others do not have to. She closed her book, hands resting on the worn cover. Then our stories are not so different, she said. He looked at her then in a way he had not yet looked at her, as if measuring not the distance between them, but the shape of a future that might exist on the other side of their fear. You found me in the grass when others rode away, Dason said. You put your hands on a wound that was not yours. You gave me words when I had only silence. If you see any kindness in me, Clara Weston, remember that you are the one who called it to the surface. Her throat tightened. She reached up almost without thinking and laid her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His fingers curled instinctively around hers. Harsh faces don't always mean hard hearts, she said. Sometimes it just means the world has teeth. The world does have teeth, he agreed. So do I, she said, a little breathless. But I would rather use mine on biscuits than on people. He laughed then, and the sound rolled through the small cabin like a friendly kind of thunder. Outside, the prairie listened, adding this moment to its long memory of blood and hoofbeats and quiet acts of mercy. High above, the same sky that watched over ruined fortresses and marble halls now watched two people in a weathered cabin, an Apache warrior and a young cowgirl learning, slowly and stubbornly, how to care for one another in a land that had taught them to be enemies. It was not a grand, tragic love yet, the kind poets shout about. It was something smaller, fiercer. A lamp kept burning, a wound cleaned twice a day, a hand offered and not withdrawn. The sort of beginning, Clara thought, that all the best stories secretly envied.